For years, millions of people watched a woman appear on their television screens and believed without question that they understood who she was. Her manner of speaking was composed, her smile warm and familiar, her presence the kind that invited trust rather than suspicion. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that made people feel at ease, the sort of person you might describe to a neighbor as someone who had everything figured out. She had built a public image that was polished, calm, and seemingly genuine, and for a long time the world accepted that image without ever thinking to look behind it. But images, no matter how carefully constructed, rarely tell the complete story. Far from the studio lights and the admiring audience, a very different reality was unfolding inside the private walls of her home, one that would eventually reach a point of no return, ending in the devastating loss of another human life. And what investigators would uncover in the weeks and months that followed would reveal a case far more disturbing, far more layered, and far more heartbreaking than anyone watching at home could have possibly imagined. This is the case of Nur Afia Dang Damon. Every criminal case leaves behind a trail. It might be physical evidence collected from a scene, patterns of behavior that point toward a conclusion, or a history that quietly explains what no one initially thought to question. The fingerprints, the digital footprints, the medical findings, and the testimonies all come together to form a picture, and that picture is what we call the case file. Everything that follows is drawn from that record, from the details that investigators gathered, from the facts that emerged through forensic analysis, and from the evidence that ultimately reached a courtroom. This is where those pieces come together. On the morning of December 13, 2021, a couple walked into a police station in Malaysia and reported something that they described as a shocking and unexpected discovery. They told officers that they had recently returned to their apartment after being away for a short period, and that upon entering their home, they had found their domestic worker collapsed on the floor, unresponsive and no longer breathing. The woman they were describing was 28 years old. Her name was Nur Afia Dang Damon. According to the couple's account, everything had happened suddenly and without warning. They said they were confused and frightened, that they could not explain what had occurred, and that they had come to the authorities immediately because they wanted the situation properly investigated. On the surface, it sounded like a tragic and unexpected death, the kind of incident that, while deeply unfortunate, sometimes does happen without any clear explanation. But when police officers arrived at the apartment and began to take in the scene before them, something shifted in the air almost immediately. The details did not align with the story they had just been told. From the moment investigators stepped inside the apartment, the environment itself raised concerns. There was a noticeable and unusually strong odor in the space, the kind associated with cleaning agents used in heavy concentration, as though someone had recently made a deliberate effort to scrub down surfaces. That alone was enough to give the officers pause. Sudden, unexplained deaths do not typically leave behind the scent of a freshly cleaned room. When they reached the area where Nur's body had been found, the concerns deepened considerably. She was lying on the floor, and even a preliminary visual examination revealed something that could not be explained away by accident or sudden illness. There were multiple visible injuries across her body. These were not the kind of marks that might result from a single fall or a brief collapse. There were signs of trauma on her head, along her arms, and across her back, distributed in a way that told a story far more complicated than a natural passing. As the officers moved carefully through the space, their unease grew into something more concrete. This was not the scene of someone who had simply lost their life without warning. This was something else entirely. As forensic specialists took a closer look at the injuries, the picture became even more troubling. What they observed went beyond the number or location of the wounds. The injuries appeared to have occurred at different points in time. Some showed signs of beginning to heal, suggesting they were days old, while others were far more recent. That detail alone was significant, because it meant that whatever had happened to Nur inside that apartment had not been a single event. It had been ongoing. But there was one specific finding that stopped the investigators cold and changed the entire direction of their thinking. Upon examining the area around her mouth, specialists documented serious damage to her teeth. The nature of that damage did not correspond with a fall or an accidental blow. The pattern suggested that the damage had been inflicted deliberately and forcefully. At that point, any remaining possibility that this had been an ordinary death was completely set aside. What the evidence was beginning to describe was a prolonged period of severe and intentional harm, something that had been happening inside that home well before the couple had ever walked into the police station. With the scene secured and the forensic team working through their initial findings, investigators turned their full attention to the two people who had filed the report. They were not strangers, and they were not unknown to the public. The woman was Etika Siti, a name that many Malaysians recognized from their television screens. Years earlier, she had competed on MasterChef Malaysia, advancing deep into the competition and becoming a familiar, well-liked presence on the show. Her on-screen personality had been composed and approachable, and the exposure had given her a recognizable public profile. After the program ended, her life appeared to continue along an equally respectable path. She married a man named Mohammed Ambry. The couple had children together, and Etika went on to pursue further education, eventually earning a doctoral degree. From the outside, it was the picture of a stable and accomplished life. Yet now that same woman, along with her husband, were at the center of a police investigation into the death of someone who had lived and worked inside their home. And crucially, they were also the people claiming they had not been present when it happened. As the investigation deepened, that claim would come under serious scrutiny. When investigators sat down with Etika and Mohammed for formal questioning, the couple maintained a consistent and seemingly straightforward account of events. They had left the apartment for a short trip. They had been away for several days. When they returned, they found Nur unresponsive and acted immediately by contacting authorities. They expressed that they were at a loss to explain what had happened and that the situation had come as a shock to them. Taken at face value, the account had a surface-level coherence. But investigators are trained to listen not just to what people say, but to what sits underneath the words, to the timing, the specifics, the things that shift even slightly between one telling and the next. And as the questioning continued, those shifts began to appear. Nothing that would immediately collapse their story, but enough to plant seeds of doubt that investigators were not prepared to ignore. The version of events that Etika and Mohammed offered started showing fractures under closer examination. Timelines that had seemed clear in the first telling became slightly less precise on repetition. Small details that should have remained fixed changed in subtle but noticeable ways. For experienced investigators, these are not insignificant observations. They are signals that a story may not be entirely grounded in truth. The behavioral dimension also attracted attention. Those present during the interrogations noted that the reactions of both individuals, while not dramatically unusual, did not fully align with what might be expected from people who had just returned home to discover someone they had known for a period of time had lost their life inside their apartment. It was not enough to make an arrest on its own, but it was more than enough to justify pushing the investigation further, past the statements and into the evidence itself. With the testimony becoming less reliable as a foundation, investigators made the call to examine the electronic devices belonging to both Etika and Mohammed. Mobile phones, in particular, had become one of the most revealing tools available to modern investigators. Unlike human memory, phones do not edit themselves, do not revise their timelines, and do not soften difficult truths. They record locations, messages, calls, and in some cases, far more than that. What investigators were looking for was anything that could place the couple's account in a factual context, anything that could either support what they had said or contradict it. The early stages of the digital review appeared, on the surface, unremarkable. But as the analysis continued, something began to emerge that would fundamentally change everything that followed. Buried within the data on the devices was content that no one had prepared for. There were photographs and video recordings that had been taken inside the apartment itself, and what those recordings documented was devastating. They showed Nur being subjected to mistreatment, not once, not in a single moment of conflict, but across multiple incidents in different circumstances, across what appeared to be a sustained period of time. The recordings were not incidental. They had been made deliberately. And they showed not a reaction or a momentary lapse, but something that appeared to have become a disturbing pattern within the walls of that home. In an instant, the couple's carefully maintained story lost all of its weight. The investigation had moved beyond a death of uncertain cause. It was now looking at a documented record of sustained and severe mistreatment that had ultimately ended a young woman's life. To fully understand the gravity of what had been uncovered, investigators took time to reconstruct the life of Nur Afia Dang Damon and understand who she had been before any of this happened. Nur was 28 years old and had come from Bulukumba, a rural area of Indonesia. Like so many young women from similar backgrounds, she had made the difficult decision to leave her home and travel abroad to work as a domestic employee, sending money back to her family and sacrificing the comfort and safety of familiar surroundings in the hope of building something better. It was a choice made out of love and necessity, the kind of quiet, unacknowledged sacrifice that goes largely unseen. She had arrived in Malaysia to work in the household of Etika and Mohammed, and from that point forward, her world had been largely confined to their apartment. She lived where she worked, she had limited access to the outside world, and she had no nearby support network to turn to if something went wrong. That isolation, as investigators were beginning to understand, was not incidental. It was part of what had made her so vulnerable. Those who knew her back home described a young woman who was warm and hardworking, someone who wrote home when she could, and who was deeply attached to her family. She had not gone to Malaysia to disappear. She had gone to help the people she loved. That she never made it back to them is a fact that sits at the very center of this case and gives it its most profound weight. With the digital evidence secured and the forensic reports continuing to come in, investigators worked to assemble a precise account of what had taken place inside the apartment during the critical period before Nur's body was found. The medical findings were unambiguous in one key respect. The injuries documented on her body had not all occurred at the same time. Wounds in different stages of recovery told a story of repeated incidents, of harm that had been inflicted over days and possibly longer. The older injuries suggested a pattern that had been building, while the more recent ones pointed to a significant escalation in the days immediately prior to her death. When that forensic information was cross-referenced with the content found on the phones, investigators were able to identify a specific and critical window of time. Between December 8 and December 11, 2021, the situation inside the apartment appears to have reached its most extreme and dangerous point. During those days, Nur had been subjected to physical abuse of serious severity. She had no way to escape, no way to call for help, and no one outside those walls who could intervene on her behalf. The recordings confirmed that both individuals in the household had been present and actively involved in what was occurring. It was not a case of one person acting, while another remained unaware. The evidence pointed clearly to a shared and deliberate pattern of behavior. Forensic specialists also noted that certain injuries were consistent with exposure to substances or conditions that would have amplified the pain inflicted, adding another layer of deliberateness to what had happened. What had begun for investigators as a suspicious death had resolved into something with a clear shape and a clear trajectory. A young woman had been subjected to prolonged and serious harm inside a private home, and she had not survived it. 3 days after Nur's body was found, on December 14, 2021, police took decisive action. Etika and Mohammed were formally arrested. The investigation, which had moved quickly and methodically from the initial scene through the forensic and digital analysis, had generated enough evidence to support charges against both of them. Their time of maintaining the pretense that they had simply returned home to an unexpected tragedy was over. The formal legal process now began in earnest. The case that eventually reached the Malaysian courts was one built on a foundation of physical evidence, digital documentation, and forensic expertise that was difficult to challenge on its merits. From the outset, prosecutors made clear that this was not a case about a single incident gone wrong. It was a case about a sustained pattern of abusive behavior that had ultimately resulted in the loss of a human life. The medical testimony presented in court was methodical and detailed. Forensic specialists walked the court through the nature and distribution of the injuries, explaining in clinical terms what the patterns meant and what they indicated about the timeline of events. The conclusion was consistent with what investigators had found from the beginning. The harm inflicted on Nur had not occurred in a single episode. It had developed and escalated over time. Experts also addressed the specific nature of certain injuries, including the dental damage that had first alarmed investigators at the scene, reinforcing the conclusion that what had happened was deliberate, sustained, and carried out with intent. The digital evidence served as a powerful complement to the medical findings. The recordings recovered from the couple's phones provided a visual and sequential record that allowed the prosecution to present the court with something beyond argument. Both accused had been present, both had participated. The content of those recordings removed ambiguity from the equation in a way that verbal testimony alone rarely can. Prosecutors also drew the court's attention to the structural conditions that had made Nur so completely vulnerable. She had lived inside the home where she worked. She had no independent means of transport or communication. She had no local relationships or support structures. She was entirely dependent on the couple who employed her, and that dependency had stripped away every avenue of escape that might otherwise have existed. She could not leave, could not ask for help, and could not alert anyone outside the apartment to what was happening inside it. That context was not incidental to the crime. It was central to it. The defense, as expected, made efforts to complicate the picture that the prosecution had drawn. Arguments were raised about personal circumstances, about the internal dynamics of the household, and about factors that, the defense suggested, should be weighed against the raw severity of the evidence. The lack of prior criminal history for both accused was raised as a mitigating consideration, as was the family situation of those involved. The court listened carefully to each of these arguments and then measured them against the evidence that had been presented, and the evidence held. Each attempt to soften or reframe the central facts ran into the same immovable obstacle. The forensic record, the digital documentation, and the medical findings all pointed in the same direction, consistently, clearly, and without contradiction. The tribunal was not deliberating over whether harm had been done. It was deliberating over the full scope and nature of that harm, and the evidence spoke plainly on that question. the verdict was delivered and it was unambiguous. Both Etika and Mohammed were found guilty and sentenced to 34 years in prison. It was a sentence that reflected not only the outcome of what had happened to Nur, but the extended and deliberate nature of the conduct that had led to it. The court made clear in its findings that this had not been an impulsive act or a single moment of violence. It had been a sustained pattern of behavior, carried out over a period of days, within a private space where the victim had no protection and no recourse. The punishment was calibrated to match the gravity of that reality. When the verdict became public, the reaction in Malaysia was swift and deeply felt. The contrast between Etika's carefully constructed public image and the reality that the trial had exposed generated a kind of collective disbelief. People who had watched her on television, who had associated her name with cooking competitions and academic achievement, found themselves struggling to reconcile those images with what had been documented in a courtroom. That dissonance between the person the public thought they knew and the truth that had been uncovered was one of the most unsettling dimensions of the case for many who followed it. But beyond the individual shock, the case sparked a broader and overdue conversation about a systemic problem that advocates and organizations had been raising for years. Domestic workers, particularly those who come from other countries and live inside the homes of their employers, occupy one of the most isolated and unprotected positions in any labor force. They live where they work, they depend entirely on their employers for their basic needs, and they often have limited access to legal protections or support services. When something goes wrong inside that private space, there is no supervisor to report to, no union to call, and no readily available mechanism for raising an alarm. Advocacy groups were vocal in the aftermath of the verdict, pointing to gaps in existing law that left workers like Nur without adequate safeguards. They cited previous cases with similar patterns, different names and different circumstances, but the same underlying vulnerability, the same isolation, the same absence of oversight. They called for stronger legal frameworks, for regular welfare checks on domestic workers, for